Well, Sampson, as the story goes, has this great gifting of strength, this might, this power. I mean, when I was a boy, I loved reading about Sampson. There's this story here in verse 5 in chapter 14. It says, Sampson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother, and they approached the vineyards of Timnah. And suddenly a young lion came roaring toward him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Sampson in power, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. Isn't that cool? I used to love that when I was a kid. Samson, he's walking along with his mom and dad. They're on their way to see a girl, because Samson has a girl problem, And they meet this young lion. I mean, I understand that it was young, which probably means it was a little smaller. But come on, I mean, how many of you could, imagine that. It's a lion. I mean, he goes and grabs it with his bare hands and rips the thing open. It's powerful. God gives him this power. God gives him this might. But see, this begins to open up a chain of events. Because you see, it says here in just a couple verses down, sometime later, he went back to marry this girl. And when he did, he turned aside to look at this lion's carcass. And in it was a swarm of bees and some honey, which he scooped out with his hands, and he ate as he went along. Now I want us to begin to move forward in this story and begin to talk about some things here. See, sometimes we read about this and we pass right over it, but what's Samson already beginning to do here in this story? He's handling the dead flesh. Here's this lion. There was nothing forbidden in terms of him killing the lion in the first place. But now he comes back and he sees that dead flesh on the ground and he begins to handle it, scoop the honey out of it. Here he is, beginning the process of starting to kind of move away from his consecration, to move away from the thing that he committed. How many times do we find ourselves, after we've been used of God, that we start handling dead flesh, start handling things that we're not supposed to, grabbing hold of things that need to be left to where they are? Do you hear me here tonight? See, there's a calling on your life. You don't need to be picking up that dead flesh. You need to leave it on the ground. We know on some level God's involved with this, that God's using this, but there's a sense that Samson is pushing beyond what God wants at times. He's being driven by lust. He's being driven by so many things that he shouldn't be. I mean, he's got this calling on his life. Why would he allow himself to be overextended in these areas? But as he gets down to the wedding party here, and he meets with them, and there's all these different things going on here. And verse 10 says his father went down to see the woman, and Samson made a feast there that was customary for bridegrooms. Now we're having another problem. Can anybody figure out what that might be? What do you think a feast entailed? What do you think they had at the feast? Wine. First he's going to handle a little flesh. Now he's going to put some things to his lips that he shouldn't. I'm not preaching against drinking wine tonight here, but I'm trying to begin to tell a story of a man who was consecrated, a man who was given certain commands, a man who had a mission and a calling in his life. I'm talking about a person that's destiny is to transform this nation in this hour, and God had began to cause him to be set apart. God had began to birth different things in his life, and I'm watching him bit by bit become careless with who he is. Bit by bit, learning to become too comfortable in his own calling and too comfortable in his own giftedness, and beginning to let certain things begin to fray at the edges. And what's strange about it is God's using him still. His Spirit's still coming on him. He's still being empowered. He's still being some level of a deliverer of Israel. But my question I have for you here as we're talking, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out, can it be sometimes that we have a great gifting and calling and purpose in our lives, but we find ourselves beginning to get reckless with it? We find ourselves taking shortcuts. We find ourselves no longer standing and consecrating ourselves the way we used to. We find ourselves losing something of who we're supposed to be. We find ourselves falling behind and not really becoming who we're supposed to be in terms of our character. That's part of the problem with Sampson. It's easy to forget the calling and the purpose in his life, but it's also easy to forget how much we're like Sampson. How much we sometimes do and hold back and expect God to just keep coming and to keep showing up. And I think that's what happens at revival. You know, it doesn't matter what I've done this week. I'm just going to go down and get prayer. It doesn't matter this. It doesn't matter what I watch. It doesn't matter how I talk to my wife. It doesn't matter how I spend my money. It doesn't matter whether I do this or I do that. It doesn't matter. God's going to keep showing up. God's going to keep moving. You know, I've got that calling in my life. I've got that purpose in my life. It doesn't matter because it's guaranteed. God loves me. God's just going to keep showing up. God's going to keep moving. And it isn't long before you find yourself lying in the lap of Delilah. You find yourself with someone whispering in your ear and beginning to speak to you, and you find yourself moving in a direction you never thought you would go. So here Samson is. He's lying in the lap of Delilah. She's whispering to him. And time has gone on now, and he's touched the flesh. He's drank the wine. So she begins to speak to him here, and you know, it says here, verse 6 here, Delilah says, in this chapter 16, verse 6, Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh thongs that have not been dried, I'll become weak as any other man." Of course, this is a lie. He's kind of joking with her. And he goes through this 3 times, telling her these things, telling her things that are not true about the secret of his strength, all along knowing that his hair, the sign of his hair, is the last straw, the last sign of his consecration. Verse 17 here it is. So he told her everything. He said, "No razor has ever been used on my head." He said, "Because I have been a Nazirite set apart to God since birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become weak as any other man." What a sad moment in this story. Here's a man who the Lord commanded him not to touch the flesh, not to drink the wine, and not to cut his hair, because these were signs and symbols of a covenant, of a commitment, of a devotion, of a consecration before the Lord. And bit by bit, he began to devalue these things. Bit by bit, he began to get the wrong idea that God would just keep coming no matter what he did. God would keep showing up no matter what kind of commitment that he made, no matter what attitude that he had. What a tragic story. You know, there's a problem that we have so often as people of God. Too often, we're actually evaluating ourselves on the basis of ourselves. We look at ourselves and say, you know what, I look good based on my own opinion. But you know, you just look at yourself in the mirror and you just smile and you say, hey, I look fine. Like ignoring the way you look, ignoring what's happening because you're just judging yourself on the basis of yourself. That's what we do. Hey, I'm fine because I'm as good as I think I am. or I'm as good as my neighbor, or we begin to evaluate ourselves and judge ourselves. And the problem is this: we always judge ourselves better than we really are. We're in the middle of revival, and we're here and we say, you know what, I'm not that bad. We stand here and God's moving, and you say, you know what, I've been pretty good about sticking with my vow. You know what, I've been pretty good about doing the thing that I said I would do. You know, I've prayed the way I said I was going to pray, and I've given the way I said I was going to give. And I've put my heart into it. On the basis of what? Yourself? See, we begin to have a problem because here we are lying in the lap of Delilah, and we don't realize that somewhere along the way we've let our guard down. Somewhere along the way we've lost our consecration. We've allowed our calling to continue, but we've forgotten our consecration. We've forgotten what we've devoted ourselves to. We've forgotten that we've made a commitment and we've made a vow. What does it feel like to lose your destiny? What does it feel like to lose your calling? What does it feel like to see everything you've ever dreamed of collapse on the ground? Do you think someone turns away overnight? Do you think someone loses their destiny in just a moment's notice? Do you think a ministry goes down the drain over one weekend? Do you think people even walk out the door just because of 1 week or 1 month? No, it's time. It's when we begin to cut corners, as we begin to forget who we're supposed to be. Listen, friends, here, I'm talking tonight to people that have a mission on their lives, a calling on their lives, people that are just like Sampson. But I'm pleading with you here. You can't begin to let your guard down. You can't begin to allow the things that are important to fall away. You can't begin to no longer value the things that first got you here. You can no longer give up on the hard task that God is calling us to. And I'm not speaking of legalism. I'm not speaking of a perfect performance. If anything, I'm telling you this: many times we can mess up a lot and God keeps coming. If Samson's any example, that would be it. He's handling the flesh. He's drinking the wine. He's living a life of lawlessness in many ways, and God kept coming down in His power. The fact that God shows up occasionally in your life is not a sign that you're heading in the right direction necessarily. We are like Sampson. We are a people with a mission. We are a people with a calling. God has called us to bring deliverance. God's called us to rescue people. God's called us to bring salvation to Israel. God's called us to bring hope and deliverance and joy and life. We cannot let this mission be cut short. We can't find ourselves waking up in the lap of Delilah. You got to make the right assessment. You got to say, who am I? Where am I going? Be. See, Samson, he woke up from his sleep and he thought, I'm going to go out as before. See, some of you come in here tonight and you say, you know what? I'm going to go in as before. I'm going to go out as before. I'm going to shake myself free. And you know the saddest thing about it here? Did you catch this line here? It says, but he did not know. How could you not know? How could you lose sight of something so important? How could you lose sight of something so significant? My concern I have tonight, friends, is that there's some sitting in this room here tonight that has had God slipping out of your hands and you don't even know it. The glory of God is slipping out of your hands, and you just keep on going like everything's the same. You're just keeping after it like it's always been the same as it always is. But I'm telling you here tonight, friends, if we don't do the things that are right, if we don't do the things that are honorable, if we don't stay committed to the commands that the Lord has given us, we're going to find ourselves in a place we don't want